Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Folks, welcome to Cosmic Shenanigans. I'm Mary SanGiovanni, up to shenanigans once again of cosmic proportions. With me here for part 2 of the House on the Borderland is Brian Keene.
Hey.
And we are going to be discussing the rest of this story, which I'm glad you're here for, because there are certain theories I have that I'm curious to see if you agree with.
And I'm going to try not to digress because your listeners responded to last week's show. Your shows are usually 20 minutes, 30 minutes long.
They are.
Last week was an hour, and that is my fault, according to your listeners. So I'm going to try to let you do the heavy lifting this week.
That's okay. But, listeners have said that they want it a little bit longer. So maybe that's a good thing. But,
okay.
First, I'd like to mention again that my newest cosmic horror novel and the second installment in the Kathy Ryan series, Behind the Door, is now available in both ebook and paperback through Kensington's Lyrical Press. You can pick up a copy through Amazon or anywhere else books are sold. In case you're curious about what it's about, some doors should never be opened. In the rural town of Zarephath, deep in the woods on the border of New Jersey and Pennsylvania, stands the door. No one knows where it came from, and no one knows where it leads. For generations, folks have come to the door seeking solace or forgiveness. They deliver a handwritten letter asking for some emotional burden to be lifted, sealed with a mixture of wax and their own blood, and they slide it beneath the door. 3 days later, their wish is answered, for better or worse. Carrie is a single mother, grieving over the suicide of her teenage daughter. She made a terrible mistake, asking the powers beyond the door to erase the painful memories of her lost child. And when she opened the door to retrieve her letter, she unleashed every sin, secret, and spirit ever trapped on the other side. Now it falls to occultist Kathy Ryan to seal the door before Zarephath becomes hell on earth. So that's Behind the Door by me. Check it out if you're so inclined. Now, to get on to this week's discussion, we're talking about The House on the Borderland by William Hope Hodgson. And again, this is part 2. So if you've missed part 1, go back and listen to last week's episode. I believe it's episode 22. And that covers the first half, I guess a little bit more than the first half of this short novel. And now we're going to cover the second half. Now, this half, to me, is really the part of the story that I think encapsulates what cosmic horror is to me. And actually encapsulates the horror part of it. Up until this point, we've had the sort of awe and wonder of a fantasy or a science fiction story. There has been horror, mind you. There has been. The pig creatures, as we discussed last week, are pretty terrifying in their way. They represent a very feral, brutal, monstrous aspect, I think, of the human character. So there is an aspect of horror there, but the aspect of cosmic horror to me comes with this second half of this story. When discussing the house, a few times throughout the story, the narrator, who I think we called Dave last episode.
Yes. Are we sticking with that?
We're sticking with that.
Okay.
We're going to stick with that. The narrator says that his house is a place long ago given over to evil and under the power of grim laws of which none here have knowledge. This place really becomes a kind of linchpin, I guess, for what we're going to discuss about what happens with time and space and with other dimensions. Really, this sort of central point is this particular house. Now, at this point in the story, and not to summarize the whole thing exactly, but at this point in the story, Hodgson says that the manuscript becomes fragmented.
Right.
And most of the fragments Excuse me, I have a cold this week, so if I sound funny, that's why. Most of the fragments talk about traveling through space and time. I had come from among the stars, vast time, the sun, far and remote. The quote that I think really sort of, captures all of it. I entered into the gulf that separates our system from the outer suns. As I sped across the dividing dark, I watched steadily the ever-growing brightness and size of our sun. Once I glanced back to the stars and saw them shift, as it were, in my wake, against the mighty background of night. So vast was the speed of my passing spirit. It was as though time had been annihilated for me, so that a year was no more to my unfleshed spirit than is a moment to an earthbound soul. So this is. Let's look at that here, because that's kind of a lot packed into one paragraph here. Part one we talked about of this story is really about traveling through space, but not time.
Right.
This period, then we get into the Sea of Sleep and this sort of traveling where we're moving through time, but not space. But in between these sections, he is moving through space and time. Like after
he's crossing both.
He's crossing both, and the house again is that focal point of this movement through time and space. So we had covered how he moved through space but not time. Again, here he's moving through space and time. Then we get to the part where he moves through time but not space, and it starts off with him, interestingly enough, reading the Bible. Now, we've talked in a couple episodes prior to this that religion, in a sense, does play a part in cosmic horror, in so much as it's usually the tenets of a religion that are shaken up by the cosmic horror itself. In this case, he's reading the Bible because he needs a reaffirmation of the God and the laws of the spiritual that he has always been taught.
Yeah, he says, I have begun in these later days to take a growing interest in that great and ancient book, referring to the Bible.
Exactly.
This astral projection, the things that are happening to him in the house, Dave is having a spiritual awakening of sorts.
Yes. And although through most of the story, and I would venture to say it isn't until the very end that he ever admits to being scared by any of this, there is something to be said about having the very foundations, both literally and figuratively, whipped out from under you when it comes to what you believe in to be the world, the universe that you live in. Now, what I find to be particularly horrific about this section of the story, all right, he moves through time. Days and nights begin to speed by, and we know this because of the sky, because the sun, shoots across the sky, and then the moon shoots across the sky, back and forth, back and forth. We watch as the dog, his dog Pepper, who stops moving, eventually crumbles to ash in this little pile in the room. We watch as the dust on the floor starts building and building and building. We watch, he takes a nap. When he wakes up, time is moving so quickly that the difference between day and night he describes as just a quiver in the sky.
Yeah, exactly. It's like a strobe light.
Exactly. And he theorizes that hundreds of thousands of years are passing within minutes. And he even finds where his own body has decayed.
Exactly.
He sees an outline, right, of his own body.
Yeah, he says, I could see the very furniture of the room rotting and decaying before my eyes. Nor was this fancy, for all at once the bookshelf along the side wall collapsed with a cracking and rending of rotten wood. That, like you said, then eventually he even sees his own body. Right,
because he surmises that the chair has decayed out from under him. He must have been sleeping, and then he dies. And so what I find horrific about this, and what is cosmic horror-ish about this idea, I think, is that there's a cosmic and almost unimaginable span of time. And in that span of time, of a series of inevitable events that are so powerful and so catastrophic, but are also so utterly beyond our ability to influence in any way. It is not just our fear of growing old and dying, but of having it all happen without our having any say in how our end will be. Of having it speed by so fast and to go so far beyond us that not even are we a forgotten memory, but that the earth itself is a forgotten memory. Time continues to go so fast that he reaches the end of everything.
Where the sun is going out. Right,
where the sun is and what I find fascinating, now you can correct me, you're better with science than I am. I don't think they really had any solid theories when this was written about what would happen when the sun went out.
There was speculation, but correct. Nothing solid.
Well,
at that time, we still thought the canals on Mars might have been manufactured.
Right.
There are some among us, myself included, who think they still are. But
they may very well be. You never know.
But yeah, he is to the end of the Earth.
Yes.
The Earth is darkening. The sun's going out. What I find curious, there's no direct correlation to his novel, The Nightland.
Right.
But The Nightland, of course, is set at the end of the Earth when the sun is going out. And all of humanity lives inside this giant pyramid. So, when was this, 1908? He wrote this?
I believe, yes, yeah.
1908. Is this a 1908 version of a shared universe? Of a mythology
exactly.
building? I don't know. I've never read any academic studies where people found a direct link between this sequence and the Nightland. But
that's an interesting point.
I like, in my head, Hodgson fan that I am, I like to pretend that's where he went. He went to the world of Nightland.
And it makes a lot of sense because there is some indication that despite the fact that this world is dead, that there's still some life out there in the universe. And we're going to come back to that. I find fascinating his almost scientific description of the sun going out in parts.
In parts, and the moon. The fact that there is no moon. He says,
right.
It's evident that the moon has greatly increased its distance from the Earth. Possibly at a later age, it may have even broken loose from Earth.
Which is sort of terrifying and fascinating at the same time. Time speeds up to the point where the sun starts to go out, and then it starts to slow down again. And there's something almost even more terrifying about that. Like we had talked about, as I mentioned before, that the house, Brian had read a passage where the furniture decays. What I think is interesting is that at this point now, the house is beginning to decay. But he notes that despite the fact that it's probably been hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, that the house is only just starting to decay, that this is evidence of it being like any other house, that we can speculate that it might be some kind of conduit between worlds and time periods, both forward and backward,
yes.
Which is another point we're going to come back to, that it's like basically a cosmic pushpin. It's holding together a number of dimensions and times to one fixed spot, and that you can go forward, backward, sideways, and all different in through time and space through this one house. Now, one might say, why wouldn't he leave this house? Well, there's also a reason for that, which we're going to come to. But he says, and everywhere and always there reigned an incredible death, silence, and desolation, the immutable, awful quiet of a dying world. And then he describes the sun finally going out. Now, it doesn't go out completely. There's a rim of fire, but for the most part, the sun is dead. And he calls it throughout the rest of the story, the dead sun. This is our sun, which is dead. And what we get, I think, in this particular section, maybe more so in the rest of the story, but it's something that we've discussed in other episodes regarding cosmic horror, is that this moves from a sort of cosmic horror nihilism and departs toward emotion, which a lot of cosmic horror, I don't want to say cosmic horror is emotionless. It's not. A lot of times the almost melodramatic reaction to the universe being not what we thought it was is almost overwrought in some cases. But there is almost a sense that the part of the story that is supposed to be nihilistic about it, that the universe itself is sad. That there's an emotional sadness in seeing things die, that there's not a cycle of life, which I think is almost more horrible than, the idea of things, living and dying and living again, is that idea that we're moving inexorably toward ultimate death, toward universal death, that there is no beginning and end and beginning and end, that it doesn't cycle through again. It's all just death. He says what he's experiencing, my thoughts at this period can scarcely be described. At first they were chaotic and wanting in coherence, but later, as the ages came and went, my soul seemed to imbibe the very essence of the oppressive solitude and dreariness that held the earth. With this feeling, there came a wonderful clearness of thought. See, again, we're not really getting that he's scared. And I realized despairingly that the world might wander forever through that enormous night. For a while, the unwholesome idea filled me with a sensation of overbearing desolation, so that I could have cried like a child. In time, however, this feeling grew almost insensibly less, and an unreasoning hope possessed me. Patiently, I waited. So, where he's moving toward, and this also, I think, is some commentary about life and death and what happens. We're not told anything about this woman that he evidently once loved. He calls her my dear one. He calls her with a capital H. She was obviously somebody who was very special to him at one point. We get the impression that she died early, although we're not told why. And that she has been essentially lost to him because, based on the way it's worded, he didn't think there was anything after death. So he assumed that he had her briefly, she was lost to him, and would have stayed lost until she meets him in this sea of slumber dimension, okay? In this sort of space between worlds, maybe, where the sleeping go or the dead go. And she keeps warning him to leave the house. She keeps saying, you need to go. This is not a good place. This house that you live in is an evil place. And he won't go because, as he makes a point that she really can't contradict, that, but if I lived anywhere else, I wouldn't be able to see you, would I? You wouldn't be able to come to me like this if I were anywhere else. And she has to admit that no, she couldn't come to him if he were anywhere else. So he opts not to leave. He opts to stay in this house regardless. And the reason I bring this up is because in a lot of horror stories, not just cosmic horror, but in a lot of horror stories in general, especially if it's a haunted house type situation, you always get that, well, why don't they just leave the house? And honestly, of all the excuses that I've heard, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources, we have no place to go. All of them are valid reasons. But this idea that the only way to hold on to someone you love is to a place that you know is eventually going to kill you, that's a pretty powerful reason to stay in this house. And it sort of speaks to that cosmic horror idea that, as we discussed in a prior episode, that sometimes death is not the be-all and end-all. Sometimes there are things worse than death. Sometimes there are things that transcend death, that are more important than death. If what you're looking for in terms of your own personal significance is to reframe it in a way that that works, in a way that makes you worth continuing on in this universe, then it may be just something as simple as that you continue on until you can get to be with the people that you love. So I thought that was an interesting, and it's an interesting, almost like interspersed kind of little scenes where, and his coming and going through this span of time and space, that he meets her, that death or the afterlife or what is just such a tiny part of the infinite sense of place and sense of time that is out there. What we come to next is the green sun, and this I did want to get Brian's opinion about. The green sun he considers the central sun, the center of the universe, and between that and the dead sun, he said those suns were they indeed the great central suns round which the whole universe of the unknown heavens revolves? Who shall say? And the bright globules floating forever in the light of the green sun and the sea of sleep on which they float. That sort of frames like what we're looking at here, because as you read this section, even I think to a practiced reader of fiction or even nonfiction of this time period, it's a little bit dense. So basically what we're looking at is this, the sea of sleep is almost, I guess in my stories, I always called it the convergence. It's the place in between all the other dimensions. It's the place maybe where the dead go, when they're waiting to find some other dimension to go to. That there is a central sun in the center of the universe around which the whole universe
and its
revolves.
Gravitational pull is pulling everything towards.
It pulls everything toward
including our sun,
exactly,
the Earth, etc. It says Earth was slowly traversing the tremendous face of the dead sun. Either the sun is traveling on an orbit of great eccentricity, or else it was approaching the green star on a lessening orbit, finally torn directly from its oblique course by the gravitational pull of the immense star.
Right.
So everything at the end of the universe is being sucked towards this
monstrous green star, which if you know anything about, and again, I don't know much about science, but I do know that stars are either red, yellow, or blue. They're never green. So it's interesting that this is a green star. Now, the globules is the part that I wanted to ask about. In the globules, and I picture them like these sort of bubbles of almost like mercury or something. In these globules, he sees faces of absolute despair. And it's one of those things that he touches on but never really follows up on.
Hodgson does that a lot.
What do you think they are? And I'll tell you what I think they are.
I personally thought they were souls of okay, if you subscribe to the theory that, human beings are composed of energy and that you cannot destroy energy. You can only transmute it. Then part of us lives on. You can call that a soul. We don't know if it has consciousness or not, but part of us, the energy that makes us up, lives on after our bodies die.
Right.
Okay, so here we are at the end of the universe. My take has always been these globules are people who died, but they still maintain at least some semblance of consciousness. And here they are at the end of the universe, and their energy is finally dying for the final time here.
See, I would tend to agree with that. I read that as them being souls too. However, the fact that they're not infinite. It's not an infinite number of globules with these faces, and the fact that they look so
this may be the last of them.
Distraught.
Because I believe that chapter is called The End of the Solar System, correct?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
This is the end of everything. So maybe these are the last souls in existence.
See, that to me is absolutely terrifying.
Oh,
because
hell yeah.
there is an idea that, when we think of the afterlife and when we think of going on infinitely, we don't ever think of that infinity as having an end as well. Like, Hodgson didn't only just go to the end of the universe and the end of time of the physical world. He went to the end of everything.
Well, you've talked about Brian Hodge on this show.
Right.
There's an inherent nihilism in Brian Hodge's work, in Laird Barron's work, in Nick Mamatas's work, who I don't believe you've covered yet, but I'm sure you will at some point. Hodgson just says, hold my beer.
Exactly. Exactly.
It doesn't get more nihilistic than this.
Right. And to me, that is the real essence of cosmic horror, is that that thing that you are afraid of is so it's so much bigger in scope than you think it is. Whatever you're afraid of, like, magnify it by millions, because that's what you're looking at here. The death of the body is one thing, but the death of the soul is something even worse. It's something even more terrifying. And that, to me, is what those globules represent, is this idea that instead of continuing on in infinity or going on and living happily ever after in heaven or whatever the case is that where this man has reached is actually the end of all things. It is spiritual death as well as physical death. And I think that's absolutely horrifying, absolutely terrifying. Now what we get to, the last thing I wanted to touch on with this story is that is his return from this trip. Okay, so he returns from this trip and he finds that the house is back, the furniture's back, everything's back, except his dog. His dog is still a pile of ash. Now, I find that very strange for a couple of reasons. One, that despite the fact that he lives with, evidently, not just his sister, but his sister's cat, that it's never really discussed how this dog became just a pile of ash, okay? But he's obviously very distraught. He's very upset because he liked this dog a lot. Pepper was his friend as well as his pet. And what he does is, you know, he kind of leaves the pile of ash there, which I find a little bit strange. And he buys another dog. And this time he buys another dog and leaves it outside. He doesn't bring the dog inside because I guess he feels like he doesn't want the dog to be sort of trampling Pepper's memory. So he has this dog tied up outside. And just because we get this sort of last bit of the intersection of dimensions, that this house is evil and that this house is ultimately going to destroy him. He knows this. And we get something of a more solid reason as to why that is when we see that the dog is attacked by something. Now, he's mentioned the thing or the things. And
the swine things.
Well, he refers to the swine things as the things. He refers to a formless thing in the house. He refers to things in the arena. There are a number of these sort of formless or indefinite, these sort of vague creatures that we don't get a sense of, which are maybe even more terrifying than the swine things, such as the thing that attacks his dog. Apparently, all it did was try to silence the dog, and it touches the dog's flank, the left side of this dog. And he knows this because it leaves a claw mark, almost like a handprint, a claw print of its having touched the dog, which burns through the fur and the skin and glows in the dark. It's a handprint, I guess, that glows in the dark, and it's a wound that continues to fester. This is almost a little bit like Color Out of Space kind of stuff. And I wonder sometimes if this is where Lovecraft maybe got this influence, that this glowing wound begins to spread over the dog. We also see...
See, I always took that to be the large swine thing. If you remember at the beginning of the story, when he travels through space, he comes to that planet where the large swine thing is, and it says in there that that it glowed with a shimmering phosphorescence.
Okay, yeah.
And then here at the end, I always took that to be the large swine.
The large
thing
swine
now
thing.
Traveled here.
That could very well be. That makes a lot of sense. But it's that idea that things are traveling. He's not just traveling out to those things. Now these things are traveling to us.
Right.
And that's been, sort of either suggested or actually, in evidence throughout the story with these swine things in particular, but not so much their gods. Like, it's one thing for these little things who maybe lived underground for generations or whatever, but now we've got their gods more or less coming through, which is what the impression I got with this.
Because this house that Dave is in
yes.
is linked to that much larger house on that distant alien planet.
Exactly. And then he mentions that he's scratched. He gets scratched by one of these things in his sleep. And it's just a little scratch, but it glows too, and it starts to spread. To the point where he shoots the dog. Spoiler alert! He shoots the dog and buries it. Now, one of the things I did want to ask Brian about, because Brian and I think, I'm not sure where to go with this particular aspect of the story. The sister doesn't understand why he shot the dog.
Right.
If this glowing wound was spreading across the dog and spreading up this man's arm, these glowing wounds, you'd think that the sister would see that. But he makes it a point to say that the sister is upset. She can't understand why he killed the dog.
Right.
And doesn't seem to be influenced by any of the things happening other than what he perceives was her distress at these things attacking, which we discussed last episode. Again, it's from his point of view.
Well, I think that could be explained like much of Hodgson's work. He does not write female characters well. In today's society, we would call it giving them agency, I believe the term is. They're foils for the plot. They're either love interests or they're foils blundering about, and the male protagonist will explain to them, this is why I've done this thing.
So you don't think it's that maybe he's the only one seeing all of this? Okay, you think it's more of a flaw in the writing?
Yeah, because during the swine thing attack in the house, the sister reacts. She
reacts, but she reacts to him. Like, if you go back and reread it, because the first time I read it, I thought she was scared of the swine things. When I went back and reread it, she's scared of how he's behaving. She never sees them. And it makes me wonder if it's that...
all in his mind?
Whether it's all in his... Now, you did say that there is an aspect at the very end that suggests that it's not all in his mind. And I do want to cover that, too, as the last thing that we talk about here. After the man's manuscript, after Dave's manuscript ends, okay, it ends sort of like with almost a cut-off sentence, as if he's being interrupted. He knows things are coming up out of the trap door in the basement. He knows that basically, his destruction is imminent. And what I find interesting is that the two who found it, Tonneson and Berignog.
Yeah, Berignog.
They discuss, do you think he's crazy? Do you think he's crazy? And Berignog is pretty much convinced, yeah, this is all in this guy's head. He had like sort of a break here. Tonneson is not so convinced. Tonneson is sure that this really happened. Now, almost to the point where you're waiting for him to say, to drop some kind of truth on Berignog and say, no, this is why I know he's not crazy, because he's that sure. And it really has more to do with the fact that they had gone through the gardens. They had gone through the ruins of the house. And they had talked to other people in the village. Once the driver comes to pick the two of them up again, they have him ask in Irish. He asked the villagers about that house. And the villagers say, this was a cursed place. It's always been a cursed place. That the oldest man in the village, the very oldest man, when he was young, when he was a little kid, the place had been shunned even then, for decades, even then, because it had been a bad place. That there had been one man who had ridden through town. He'd gone to the ruins of the house. It was a ruin. It was ruins even then, when this old man was young. And he had gone to that town, and he came back a few hours later. Then he brought somebody. He brought an old woman, and I believe it was a pet, some kind of pet, a donkey maybe, and settled there in that house. And then a man would come and bring them provisions, bring them like groceries and whatnot. And then when the man stopped coming, they discovered it was because everything around the house had collapsed into that great pit. That basically it was like everything had been sucked down. What I find interesting is that, given the way it's written, it almost sounds like the house is in ruins before it could have been. And I say that because if you're reading the chronology of everything and you're reading the manuscript that these two young men have found, and you're listening to the villagers talk about, the house being a house and being ruins before, long before anybody could ever see this, what it makes me think is that what Hodgson is trying to say is that this place exists forwards and backwards in time as well as space.
Not only that, there's a sequence during the Green Star where it's suggested that the universe reboots itself and starts all over again. It's a throwaway sentence. I don't have the book here in front of me, so I can't remember what it is. But you now that's not canon, but you can certainly take that from the reading.
See, that's interesting, because I theorized that the horror of it was that it doesn't reboot, and that's why the souls look so sad, because it is the end of everything.
Maybe it is.
But
maybe the house has rebooted itself.
Now, see, that would add an extra dimension of scary to it, because maybe the universe doesn't reboot, but this thing existing outside somehow of time and space can reboot itself.
Right.
So, anything else? Anything else you want to add to that?
I will. Or if we're wrapping up, I will say there is a completely different ending. If you don't like the ending to this one, DC. Now, last week we talked about how it's influenced Simon Clarke, Tim Levin, Sharon Mayville, myself. But there have been adaptations over the years. DC Comics back in 2000 did a hardcover 96-page graphic novel adaptation of The House on the Borderland. It's got a great introduction by Alan Moore. It was written by Simon Revelstoke. The art was by the great Richard Corbin, one of my favorite artists. Now, Revelstoke kind of updated it. He moved it to 1952 Ireland.
Okay.
He kept most of the original plot and dialogue, but he comes up with a completely different ending. I'm not going to spoil it here on the air. I was not... I think it's a very well done adaptation. I wasn't crazy about what he did with the ending, but you know what? The guy tried to do something different. Kudos to him. But yeah, so there's that. That was nominated for an International Horror Guild Award.
Really?
I don't think it was nominated for a Stoker that year. I don't think the Stokers. I don't.
They probably didn't do graphic novels then.
At that point. I don't think they did. There's. If you're a doom metal fan, if you like bands like Yob and Witch Mountain, doom metal band Electric Wizard has a song based on the novel. It's called, oddly enough, House on the Borderland. American rock band Into Another has a song about the book. Los Watsons, they're a Spanish pop band. They have a song about it. It was adapted for BBC Radio in 2007, so it lives on. And of course, like I said, it inspired Clark Ashton Smith, Lovecraft, Terry Pratchett, everybody else we mentioned last week. So
it's definitely one of those stories, I think, that bridges several gaps. When I first started the show, I talked about how prior to Cosmic Horror there was weird fiction and there was science fantasy. And that there were, the old romantics, not romance novels, but like romanticism, the way what it used to mean. And I think that this is one of those stories.
Well, this was the one. This was the big departure from, the typical Gothic fiction of that era towards a more realistic, scientific, cosmic horror. This
exactly,
was it, right?
and it ties it all together. Though it has, much like this house, it is a conduit of all these things. All of the prior influences feeding into this one story and then feeding outward into actual cosmic horror in all its different forms.
Right.
So it's actually a very seminal work, and I definitely recommend, if you have not read it, despite our spoilers on the show, because that's what I do, that you actually check it out and read it, because it is a pretty much a crucial story to understanding cosmic horror and how it was shaped over the next 2 or 3 decades following.
Right.
So thank you very much for your insight. And I really like that you brought in comic books and music and other adaptations, because that's what I'm trying to cover, not just stories here, but all the different media that cosmic horror permeates. And I like that you follow up with other things that House on the Borderland has influenced. So that's very cool.
Well, thank you for having me. And my apologies to Mary's regular listeners. I won't be on next week, so you can have Professor SanGiovanni all to yourself.
Oh, I liked having you. I thought
you've
it was
had
awesome.
Paul Tremblay. You've had me. Who will you have next?
There's a few people I would like to have. I'd like to talk to Laird Barron at some point.
Okay. There you go, Laird. The onus is on you.
And there are a few other people I have on my list that I'd like to talk cosmic horror with. But in the meantime, you have me. And if you enjoy Cosmic Shenanigans, which I hope you do, then you might also enjoy another show that I co-host, The Horror Show with Brian Keene, which me. Brian Keene also is on. Both of them are available on iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, iHeartRadio, and all other platforms via the Project Entertainment Network, and they are all available for free. I'd also like to thank Dave Thomas, our engineer. You can watch his channel most nights at twitch.tv/meteornotes. And I hope you'll tune in next time for our next cosmic horror story. Thanks for listening. Bye.
This is Jim Adams from Monster Attack. Hey, if you remember that monster movie from your childhood that got it all started for you, the one that really got you interested in monster movies, horror movies, sci-fis, and cult films, then you're going to want to listen every week to Monster Attack. We look at some of our favorite monster movies from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. With new episodes uploaded every Monday, it's Monster Attack. Exclusively on the Project Entertainment Network.